Hello, University of Nebraska, Omaha. I want to thank Jeremy for asking me to participate in your class and talking about assessment. I am Bob Reeker from Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm currently a K through 5 art educator here in Lincoln for Lincoln Public Schools, and I've been teaching at the elementary level for the last 30 years. 28 of it has been in the art room, and 2 of it I was an assistant administrator, assistant principal for 2 years. It wasn't a fit for me, so I went back to the art room. I also am an adjunct instructor at Nebraska Wesleyan, where I teach the elementary art methods course. I've done that for about 15 semesters. And then finally, I am the president-elect of the Nebraska Art Teachers Association. So I'm heavily involved in volunteerism through that organization, as well as the National Art Education Association. So I'm joining you today because we're going to talk a few minutes here about assessment in the elementary art program. Again, this is based on 30 years of teaching K through 5 art education, as well as several semesters of teaching elementary art methods in the university setting. So I always like to start class, whether it's at the elementary level or in my college classes, with kind of the big idea. And today's big idea is that assessment assists us in better understanding both student process and product. There was a time in art education where the focus was strictly on the product. What was it that children produced, and what kind of grade or assessment or evaluation could we put on that final product? Over the years, and current trends right now are to really look at both process and product. In fact, I would even argue that probably process has taken over more so than even the product has. How do we help kids to take what they are thinking and be able to visualize that and put that out there for us to be able to assess them? Elliot Eisner was a leader in art education, and he passed away just a few years ago. But I really like this quote that he gave us. He said, "Perhaps giving competing notions about the quality of education, there should be 2 types of assessment: a large-scale temperature-taking test to provide comparative data on the performance of schools, and an assessment that reveals the distinct talents of individual students and the effects of school practice on their development. One focuses on the general and the other on the particular." And I think the way our current school system is set up, the large-scale temperature-taking test is, of course, your standardized testing that is done across the state in reading, math, and science. And then I think the arts help to provide the balance of that when we take a look at those talents that individual students have. We can think of that kind of assessment as maybe more of a performance-based assessment, where the previous one I talked about is more of your standardized. And we're going to talk about a little more about those 2 here in just a few minutes. I have had the interest of assessment for many, many years, and just a few years ago, Nancy Walkup, who's the editor of School Arts Magazine, asked me to write a couple of brief articles that they ran. And so I titled them Assessment on the Run, because it was this idea that elementary art teachers who see anywhere from 300 to 1,000 students within a few-day rotation, they're always on the run. We're just going. So how do we make assessment both meaningful and manageable at the same time? So these are 2 articles that I wrote for that. Here are some learning targets that we're going to focus on. The last one that has popped up here is I want you to be able to consider and apply assessment concepts and strategies in any of your college prep work. So I'm hoping what I'm going to share with you today has applicability. Going back, though, I want you to know how and why we do assess in the elementary art program, and try to understand there are varied strategies for assessment. I'm going to give you lots of examples today. So how do we assess? Well, the ways, and there's really 2 basic ones that we can look at, is through formative assessment as well as summative assessment or summative evaluation. We'll talk about the difference in those. And then the types that I've already alluded to and shared are both standardized and performance. And again, we will go into those in a little bit more. So why do we assess? Well, we assess because we have to be held accountable for the work that we do with children. We have stakeholders that expect things to happen from us. And so we have stakeholders like our students and our parents, guardians, who probably impacted most directly because it impacts the future of the children that are being sent to our classroom. But of course, we should also be accountable to our colleagues because we're working as a team in order to make the best possible learning for children. Certainly our administrators are stakeholders who are watching over and making sure that their program is running in their schools. Our community have an investment in what it is that we produce in terms of students. We certainly have government regulations and stakeholders as well, because certainly we get our funds from both state and federal mandates. And so it's imperative that we take the government into account as we're looking at assessment. And then there's certainly maybe others that you can even think about. So to get back to the ways, formative, if you're not familiar with the term, means kind of that ongoing assessment that you're doing. A lot of times, this kind of assessment's not written down or even graded, but what it does is it gives you a temperature check. It gives you the opportunity to kind of see what's happening in the classroom. Are students understanding a concept? And if they are, great, move on to the next concept. And if they're not, you probably do need to reteach. So there's lots of ways that you can gather that formative information. I'll share some of those yet today with you. And then the other one being summative. A lot of times people think of things like a final exam or test, as well as a report card as kind of that summative evaluation or summative assessment. So it's more of the final piece that happens when you're looking at assessing children. So to get back to the standardized testing and the performance testing, one of the questions I like to pose to my class is, why do schools in many curriculum areas choose to focus on and put so much emphasis and attention on standardized testing? Well, here are some thoughts we come up with. There are mandates by both federal and or state, right? There are tests that are given, and sometimes, quite often, the monies that we get in schools can be dictated by the scores that our children get. So we have to make sure that we are following those mandates and providing the instruction that best supports children in areas that are standardized tests. The fine arts in Nebraska are not considered mandates because they are not standardized tests across the state. You know, apparently it does provide a benchmark for comparison. I think I struggle with this one a bit, because I think of a third grader in Lincoln, Nebraska, and a third grader out in Gering, Nebraska, as being very different kinds of learners based on upbringing, the type of dynamics that happen in the community, the school system they have, the needs that that each of those communities have for the type of citizen that they produce. So even though I know a standardized test can do that, I do think that there are other dynamics that have to be taken into account as you're looking at the scores across the state with standardized testing. And I think a key piece is they're easy to administer and score. Nowadays, we can put them on the computer, take the test, and we get that score back in a matter of seconds. You might even think of other reasons why schools put so much emphasis on standardized testing. Then the flip to that is more of our performance-based assessment. I think the arts do a good job of doing this, but why aren't they utilized in education as much? Well, they are more difficult to develop because they're based on individuals rather than a large group. So it takes time to create these kind of assessments. Oftentimes teachers are not trained in this area. And there could be others. And the one that I think of too is, it is very time consuming. And so to put forth a performance-based type of assessment means it's going to require both time from the student as well as the teacher in order to get that kind of assessment done. So let's just walk through. As I think about assessment, I do that from the very beginning as I'm planning. So as I look at my standards and I start picking my unit goals, I then move into my learning targets of what I want the children to learn each time that I see them, leading towards that standard that they're going to meet. And then as I'm doing that, I'm also planning for assessment. I feel they should go hand in hand in hand as you go along, because it just makes the whole unit very comprehensive. So we're going to take a look at some performance-based types of assessment, and hopefully some that are more manageable and less time consuming, but some do take time. And one of the first ones that we can look at is in terms of this summative assessment. It's teacher and student labor intensive, but the evidence that you get is really involved. And the first one that I'm going to share is portfolios. So whether you choose to have an electronic or a hard copy portfolio, it can be time consuming, but you can get a lot of information from it. I think it's important to remember a portfolio goes beyond just putting a bunch of stuff in a folder or in a document. A portfolio should be all about selecting and then reflecting and writing and responding to what it is that you put in the portfolio. What did you learn? How do the pieces compare to one another? You want to push students to think beyond just sticking the artwork in and thinking that it's done. there should be some thought and process in it. It allows for voice and choice and agency by the student. It can be a collaborative kind of idea as to what goes in there. Should it be a 1 year, an ongoing portfolio? So it can really, give a great overview and depth to a student's year or their entire career if you choose to do them K through 5. Here's an example of an e-portfolio that we used to implement in Lincoln Public Schools. This is actually my daughter's, but this was from 4th grade. And you can see here she has a collection, and she also has some writing that connected to this piece as well, because I wanted to make sure to implement that portfolio piece. I also have done lots of projects over the years connected to rubrics. These are some paintings from the early 2000s that I did with kids, and I had created a rubric to go with it. We focused primarily on George O'Keeffe during that time. If I was doing a unit similar today, I probably would focus more on a theme of nature rather than a specific artist. But that's a whole nother topic to discuss at another time. But you can see here, I provided the criteria for students as well as the techniques that they were going to do. The grading system of a 4, 3, 2, 1, 3 meeting the criteria, 4 going above and beyond, and a 2 and a 1 not meeting the standard. So there are the criteria. And then the child was expected to mark 1 in each row, and there were a couple where they even had to write. And then I would give them feedback as to how they felt they did. I've also done rubrics that are more of a checklist where the criteria is here, they mark, I mark, and give them feedback. And so it's a more simplified way to do a rubric. And then kind of the newer trend with rubrics is doing something more of a 1-point rubric. And this is one that I'm using with my college level course right now. You only provide the standard, the 3 in the middle, for the learner to consider, and then they mark accordingly in each row. And if they mark a 4, a 2, or a 1, they give documentation as to why they feel each of these require those. There's a place for learner statement, as well as then for the instructor to give feedback. There's even simple ones like this visual art rubric where little people can even mark, and it has the faces and things to mark accordingly for criteria, craftsmanship, creativity, and behavior. I don't love that image for behavior. I think that kind of establishes negative behavior, but in general, I think this is a nice rubric for young people to be able to use. Then we can move through assessment that's mostly done through observation. Sometimes you document it. Many years ago in Lincoln Public Schools, we created this pats on the back, which stands for praise, ask, tell, suggest. So you could use this partway through a project where you would lay these out next to student artworks. Children would walk around with pencils and write those statements to their peers, giving them some feedback. And then when all 4 areas were filled out, the student artists could then fill out a summary responding to these 4 things in order to give some feedback and allow the teacher to be able to also then write towards them, back to them. I've also used this just for critiques, verbal critiques, where I might write 1 or 2 of these on the board, and then as we hold artworks up, they have to tell us if they're going to praise or suggest the artist. And so it can work lots of different ways if this kind of feedback and assessment works for you. There's also some other types of assessment from peers that work well, and that's chips and sticky notes. These are the 4 pieces to it. You set the criteria, you provide the tool for the assessment, you give time for the peers to give feedback, and then you debrief. So here's an example of a postcard project I used to do with kids, and the criteria were perspective, value, line. So each artist would have a sticky note next to them, numbered 1, 2, 3. And then peers would walk around and they would stop at 3 different artworks, and they would write one of those words to say what they felt the artist had done the best job of so far. Remember, this kind of assessment probably would be done around 2/3 through the project. So there were times to go back and actually implement the feedback. And then the debriefing afterwards, after the words were written, we talk about, how many of you have all 3 words? Great. Evidently your peers feel you've covered them all. Does anybody have 1 word repeated all 3 times? Great. If you have down line, you probably have covered line really well. But what can you do today to add perspective or value to your project? And then this is another one, another token where you would just assign words or vocabulary to these different colors. And then children would go around and just lay out the colors accordingly. Same kind of debriefing where you would talk about the chips they have versus the chips they don't have. And the ones they don't have, what can they do to try to improve those concepts in their artwork? Some of the formative assessment pieces, again, are about checking for understanding. They're often not recorded, but they help the teacher to guide the lesson. And so questioning is a great one, right? It helps to provide both individual and group feedback. And I'm a big proponent on using nonverbals to get this across. So how can we have students use their fingers to do a rank or a rating of 1 to 5, or questions that are phrased as 1, 2, 3 choices with children holding up, or stand up or sit down, those kinds of things where they don't have to talk, but they can use their body and you can get a quick reference. So here's an example. In this nature illustration here, what kinds of lines did the artist use mostly? Hold up 1 finger if they use mostly curved lines, 2 fingers if they use mostly straight lines. And then if I looked around and I saw mostly 1s, we probably could move on. If I saw mostly 2s, we might have to reteach what kinds of lines that we see in art and then reassess. Or the same thing here, using the term of shape and form. Hold up your fingers for which one you think is the form and go on. And I'm sorry, this picture is very dated from the late 90s, because you can see overhead projector, you can see an old computer, you can see that, but I still see the TV, but it still gives you an idea of how you might do that assessment. I'm a big believer in walk-arounds or gallery walks, where you lay the artwork out partway through the project. You give time to walk around without touching. You come back and sit down, you debrief what it is that you saw, and that gives you some understanding of where kids are at and what they're thinking as they're producing work. And then closure, and I think that's probably one of the most difficult things that teachers do, because we run out of time, but try to fit closure into whatever it is that you're doing. You can do this when they're at their tables, when they're lining up. Ask them questions like, name a significant style of Picasso's development, or what is one thing you would ask your family at the dinner table tonight that you learned today? Or if you're not familiar with exit tickets, you give the kids a concept from the lesson that day, and they have to write for you words or phrases for you to better understand what it is that they learn, and then they hand those in as they walk out. So I'm hoping today that as you've listened to my sharing, you were able to know how and why we assess children in the elementary art program, understand all the different strategies for assessment, and I've touched on just a few. There are, of course, others. And then this last one, hopefully you can take some of the information that I've shared with you today and be able to apply it to your schooling as you prepare to become teachers. Our big idea, once again, is assessment assists us in better understanding both student process and product. And again, I want to thank Jeremy for allowing me to join you today through this video. I hope you've taken away some things around assessment in the elementary art program. There's my information there. And if there's ever a time that you would like to discuss assessment, or if you have questions, feel free to email me at breeker@nebrwesleyan.edu. I hope you have a great rest of the semester, and take care.